Thank you.
Brilliant.
I am going to share my screen in a moment, but I'll just say hello so you can see my face first off, tell you a bit who I am. So I'm Gillian Annable. I'm an academic. I work at the Institute for Transport Study at the University of Leeds. And although I'm an academic, everything that I've done in my career to date is all about policy, what really happens on the ground with respect to making places, making good transport systems, and really trying to understand what works and where it works, why it works there and not in some other places. I'm going to talk to you about local transport mainly, and I'll put it in the context of climate change, but as I'll say, there's all kinds of reasons why we want to get the transport system right, because it's just so important to our lives. So hopefully I'll give you a bit of food for thought, and I'll be sticking around for some of the Q&A sessions later on. Okay, so let's hope that this sharing works.
Yep, that looks like it's working.
I had a funny message about muting or unmuting or something, but hopefully you can hear me now. And can you see my screen?
Yeah, we can see your screen, but it's not on slideshow. It's not on kind of presentation mode yet. That's it, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's me, as I say. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to you about travelling, why it's important to get things a bit in a healthier shape than we seem to have done so lately, whether that's in your local area or really almost everywhere you look, there are issues. With respect to climate change, travelling, and that includes everything. So that includes our personal transport locally by cars and buses, etc. It includes air travel and it includes freight travel. If you add all of that up, it adds up to around a third of all the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit as a country, as a population in the UK. Cars account for the majority of that. They still will do by all modelling for some time to come, and indeed emissions from cars are actually rising and have been rising lately, and that's because cars, petrol and diesel cars that we're still owning and buying, they're getting bigger and bigger. So although we're using some electric vehicles, actually we're buying more of the larger vehicles at the moment than we are electric vehicles, and so emissions are actually still rising from cars, which is a problem. And as I say, it's not just about climate change, it's about all the other things that travelling is involved with, all the other kind of problems. So of course we have air pollution as well. So climate change is different from air pollution. There are different gases involved in air pollution. And this is a real problem to public health, particularly younger people and those with any sort of vulnerable health conditions. Of course, we all know about congestion and the time that gets wasted when we're trying to travel. And that's congestion on our roads, but it can also be congestion on some of our public transport network. Obesity is partly due to the way in which our travel habits have become more and more dependent on the car, which means we do less active travel. So we often use this term active travel, which involves walking and cycling, and increasingly things like scooters, electric scooters and so on. And we're doing less and less of that over the decades, and we've got big ambitions, whichever local council you look at or as a country, to really try and increase the amount that our population walks and cycles. Of course, the transport system, in order to improve it, particularly if we try and improve congestion by building roads and expanding our road capacity, then we've got to find more land to build those roads on, and more land to park the cars that we're buying. And that has its own consequences, including a lot of destruction to local wildlife and so on. There's also issues with people struggling to afford a car. So the more we orient our society around the car and keep building to try and accommodate more and more car use, then those people who haven't got a car struggle to try and afford one and keep to be able to afford one. And that's proven to be a real struggle for a big segment of society. And then of course you've got people who don't have a car. Actually 1 in 4 households don't have any car at all on average across the country. And they can become more and more disadvantaged as public transport sort of gets depleted and services move away, because we're catering more towards people that have got a car than who don't have a car a lot of the time. So there's all kinds of reasons to really, really try and see what we can do to improve the situation. Now, when we talk about climate change, we often think about the solutions to the transport system in really one of two ways, just to kind of keep it simple. And this is quite a nice, I think, sort of simplification. It's quite helpful. So the first thing we can do is to get rid of all the fossil fuels out of the transport system. Yeah, so the petrol and diesel and kerosene in planes. So we need to try and get away from petrol and diesel and so on and find a different way of fueling our vehicles. So that we absolutely have to do, and there's all guns a-blazing as to try and do that as quickly as we possibly can. Then the other way we can do it is actually to travel less by these motorized means. So we can maybe reduce the distances that we travel, reduce the frequency that we travel, and of course reduce the amount that we're dependent on things that involve fuel, and try and do more active travel. So we need to do both of those things, and it is true that if we could go with the technology and we could sort of get this sorted overnight, if you like, then perhaps we wouldn't have to do number two. But the fact of the matter is that there are so many issues, and I'll explain a few of them, as to why it's going to still go quite slowly to get rid of those fossil fuels out of the system, that whichever way we look at it, we can't just rely on one, we have got to do both. So why might that be? Well, a few, as I say, a bit of food for thought for you. So we want to get rid of the petrol and diesel, and we're doing that, and anything we could do to accelerate that is absolutely essential. But whichever way we look at it, even if everybody who went out and bought a new car from tomorrow, absolutely everybody bought an electric car, it would still be 15 years before every single car out there on our roads was electric. And that's because it takes 15 years to what we'd say renew our fleet, because of course people keep cars or cars are kept in circulation for around 15 years. So there's a time scale there that's really quite problematic. So although we've got the ban on pure petrol and diesel cars from 2030 coming in this country, new ones, the old ones, all the ones that we're buying up until that date, will still be running around on our roads out into the 2040s.
Gillian, two minutes left now. Okay,
thank you. And then, as I said before, although electric vehicle sales are increasing, and they will continue to increase by the looks of it, we're also at the same time selling bigger cars, bigger petrol and diesel cars. As I say, they're going to be running around for a long time. We can have hydrogen electric buses and ferries as well. They're really good. They've proven to be able to work, but they are more expensive. So we're going to have to find, as taxpayers, the money to bring those vehicles in if we want to accelerate their uptake. And of course, thinking about the freight side, then hydrogen electric lorries are even further away. So we've got all those emissions that are still going to be carrying on for years and years. And then whenever we talk about an alternative to petrol and diesel, we're still talking about vehicles which require a lot of resources to make them, the steel, the plastics in them, the lithium in the batteries, etc. There's no such thing as a sort of zero emissions vehicle. There are still environmental footprints with all of these solutions. And then also, if we build roads to try and accommodate all these vehicles, it has been shown wherever you look at in the world, whichever roads you look at, that you build a road or you expand the road capacity, and actually the volume of traffic expands over time. That's because new connections are possible. People think, oh, right, now it's quicker to go from A to B, so I'll live in A and I'll work in B. And it generates all these options and possibilities. So expanding roads is necessary sometimes, but it's only a temporary solution to any of our problems. So that means that whatever we do, we've got to also try and reduce the amount of travel. So we've got to try and get active travel up, particularly for our health. We can reduce some of our emissions through active travel, but actually lots of car trips are less than 5 miles, could be walked and cycled, but it's only going to get us so far, because the majority of miles, which equates to the majority of emissions, are actually eaten up by all the longer journeys that we do. So we've got to find a way of tackling some of the longer journeys. So you can look across the water to the Netherlands and we think, oh, they've got it sorted there, they cycle all over the place. But actually they do lots more cycling, but they also do a lot more driving. So their carbon footprint from travel in the Netherlands is actually no less than ours. So it shows that if we're going to get more walking and cycling, we've also got to reduce our car use at the same time. We can think about electric bikes. This is a really interesting solution. These have a longer range. They can hit some of these bit longer journeys. So to do that, we need to encourage our local authorities to build cycle paths over a sort of longer distance, not just little short links in the centre of towns and so on, but longer paths that link up where we're living and working, shopping and visiting friends and family over longer distances.
Gillian, I'm going to have to ask you, I really hate to do this because it's all really useful and interesting stuff, but I'm going to have to ask you to speed through this last bit. I will, and we need to swap some of our longer car journeys for walking and cycling and bus journeys. So what we've got to do there is try and get people to use and access destinations that are closer to home rather than going longer distances. And to do that, we need to encourage our authorities to put services back, shops and doctor surgeries and so on, nearer to where we're living and working, so they're not all disappearing out to the edges. And the same applies for freight. So we need to try and source our goods from closer to home and also get those goods onto things like cargo bikes for local deliveries. And we need to share our cars. So it's not just about changing the technology, but also thinking about how we can reduce the number of cars that are out there and use them more efficiently. Because most of the time they're either sitting stationary or they're moving around with one person in. And then finally, we need to, of course, think about public transport. So one of the reasons public transport has been depleted and we're so frustrated with it a lot of the time is that over the decades, it has actually had to compete with a car, which has become more and more attractive. So it's proven that where the car has a better run, where there's lots of generous parking in a place, or it's just better to own a car, then public transport is actually more expensive because it's actually really not getting the passengers it needs for the revenue. So it's a horrible vicious circle. So we as a society and as local populations have to really support some of our taxpayer money going into subsidising that public transport in order to change that vicious circle back in the opposite direction, to make public transport more attractive and extract people away from their car so that it in turn can have a more favourable operating environment. So what I've done on my final slide, which you'll have access to after this, is to put some examples of different types of policy and I've mentioned them all really as I've gone through, the different sorts of areas where you can try and encourage or think about specific solutions that actually make sense in the places that you know and where you live and work. Okay, that's great, thank you. That's brilliant, Gillian. There's loads of things for people to think about there, and